When I was a kid, I used to hear the voices. Distorted voices, like they were ghosts emerging from a sea of white noise, and cryptic, incomprehensible sounds. I still remember some of them. Notes that follow a precise rhythm coming from a speaker and resonating in a big room. And from that big room, when the door was open, they resonated in my whole house. The image that I have in my memory of this room is very dark, at night time, with high ceilings barely visible in the darkness, and a small, feeble lamp that illuminates just a table with a lot of strange equipment on it, arrayed with buttons and knobs. My dad, barely scratched by the light, is sitting at the table in this big space, listening to the voices, looking for them and speaking with them in a strange language consisting of words, letters, numbers and sounds. My dad has been a radio amateur since his 20s. He's still very passionate about it. He builds his own antennas, and in the past he also used to make them for other people. Probably in a subconscious way, my interest in sounds, noise, electronic instruments and DIY comes from this activity as a radio amateur I was exposed to since birth. I always had a huge fascination with radios, electromagnetic waves, science and technology. Growing up though, my path took me in another direction. I didn't learn too much about radio transmissions and was very far from the idea of being a radio amateur. But a few years ago, in my musical research process with aleatoric sound sources, soundscapes and improvisation, I started thinking about radio signals and how to incorporate them in my music. I asked my dad if I could listen to some of his sessions. With my adult ears, the ones of a musician and composer with a passion for Pauline Oliveros, John Cage and Murray Schafer, I discovered some amazing things simply listening to him surfing the radio waves. There is such a vibrant soundscape hidden in that background noise, and the wonder of the research and discovery for someone or something out there is so exciting and inspiring. The fact that noise is also a big part of this sonic landscape is pretty important for me. It is a perfect representation of the fact that noise is everywhere. It is the space where we move, the time that we live. It is the sea where we swim, a sound that contains all of the sounds, and it is no single one of them. To be able to listen to something human or not in this soundscape is such a unique feeling. Hearing some distant and distorted voices is always a surprise and an otherworldly experience. Looking for someone out there, a ghost, a human being, or something else, a machine. It reminds me of the phenomenon called pareidolia. Pareidolia means to recognize a familiar shape in a blurry or unshaped image or sound, like watching the clouds and seeing a face or an animal. In the sound realm, you can recognize words where there are just interferences, or super quiet ones blurred in the noise, or voices where there are just machines transmitting codes, like code languages made of tones. An example, the Morse code, a single-tone binary code language made with an 800 Hz tone with two distinct lengths, short and long. A sequence of these tones represent a letter or a number.
La prima modalità di codificare il pensiero umano non con una parola e trasmetterlo è stato CW, un acronimo di Continuous Wave, è stato inventato da Henry Morse. Praticamente è un'onda portante continua alla frequenza di 800 Hz che l'orecchio umano distingue rispetto al rumore. Il metodo per trasmetterlo è semplicemente un interruttore, perché il tasto telegrafico, questo è il tasto telegrafico originario, è un interruttore. Questo ha trasmesso ciao, per esempio.
Okay. Other languages use other tones, even more than one at the same time, at specific intervals and sometimes scales. Codes shares with music and organize sounds some basic principles: pitch, length, rhythm, repetition, harmony. On the other hand, they are mysterious, encrypted and cryptic, fascinating, alien to music. They have a precise purpose, but they are also open to other interpretations. This ambivalence in the meaning made me feel that they are worth an exploration, and they can be conceived as a soundscape, balanced between noise and music. But in the end, it is just the basic human need for communication and connections that drives this world. How can I incorporate this into my music? I started to think about to communicate in 2021. In that moment my work was deeply bound to the idea of aleatoric sound sources, since I was in the middle of my exploration of no input and feedback. Sounds created with machines that are not supposed to make sounds, but just to channel them, giving a new meaning to a technology created for another purpose. The radio seemed to fit pretty well in this concept. A sound source that you cannot completely control requires a different approach, both in terms of performance and composition. We are not speaking about an instrument in the classic way. It is more of a machine that you can enter into dialogue with, action and reaction to what happens inside of its circuit. But you are never fully in control of the situation. For this reason, improvisation is a huge part of this project, as much as in my whole musical research. It is inherent to it. Unpredictability, a concept that totally fits the idea of using radio transmissions as the main material for a music composition. You can't find the same thing twice. Everything depends on the time of the day, the weather conditions, the distance between you and the sender, etc. It is a completely autonomous soundscape that follows its own rules. But how can you combine it with no input and feedback? At a surface level, no input seems the opposite of radio communication. It is a signal that stays in the same place, a feedback loop that goes nowhere. Cause and effect are denied. The output influences the input of the system that changes the output that influences the input, and so on. Time is defeated. It is a closed circle. On the other hand, the waves that you transmit with a radio travels around the globe and through time and space. They connect 2 points with the goal of communication. But in the end, feedback and radio transmissions have more in common than you can imagine. Their timbre, how they sound, is similar. Background noise is always their source, the sea of electromagnetic fields and electrons where they belong. So I was very surprised to recognize a natural coherence between them on a sonic level. The idea to combine them for me was particularly fascinating. It is a way to overcome their specific purposes and their nature, to break a barrier. On a metaphorical level, in To Communicate, I want to create a new sonic world based on communication, radio transmissions, and internal self-reflection, no input and feedback. The presence of both in this world is such a rich and vast field to explore. Trying to communicate an inner and apparently closed world, our inner one, and create a connection with someone else is such a basic need that I consider this project more human than what it first seems. Technology is an inherent part of this process, as well as the relationship between humans and technology. A bond that we have faced since the beginning of time and that is part of our life nowadays more than ever. To communicate takes the relationship between man and machine and exposes it directly. A basic, inner and deep human need for connection is made possible through the use of machines and science and technology. But these are not only means, they are what changes our perception of the world, our possibilities, and our presence on Earth with other human beings. Everything in To Communicate, at least in this first phase and on a conceptual level, sounded great to me. It was time to test it. At first I asked my dad to attend to one of his normal sessions with the radio. I took his audio signal and processed it live. He was not listening to my work to avoid being distracted by the extreme manipulation I made with the sounds coming from the radio transmissions. I pressed the record. We did it a couple of times, then the project was put on hold due to other reasons, life and other works. In 2024, I heard that a couple of friends, Nicola Facchini, a visual artist, and Giuseppe de Benedittis, a musician, built an acousmonium, a series of handmade speakers made of wood, metal and resonant surfaces created to play electronic and electroacoustic music. The word acousmonium was invented by François Bayle, an electronic music composer who is also one of the composers and theorists behind the musique concrète, and invented the word acousmatic music, a type of electronic music composition that uses fixed media and recorded sounds, mostly on tape in that early stage of electronic music. In 1974 he designed the first acousmonium, an orchestra of 80 speakers conceived specifically to diffuse the sound of electroacoustic and acousmatic music in a very immersive way. But back to OrganoMotore. OrganoMotore is composed by 16 speakers that cover the entire frequency spectrum that we can hear and even some that we cannot. The bass shaker, a huge loudspeaker placed on the ground, plays frequencies from 80 Hz down to 1 Hz, well below the human ear's capabilities. I met Nicola when we both studied in Venice, around 10 years ago. He was at the Accademia di Belle Arti making paintings and sculptures. I was curious about the origin story of OrganoMotore, which is a rather different artwork from what he uses to do. So I asked him why. He told me his ears don't work very well lately, so he wanted a device to listen to some music at higher volumes. It took the DIY route and started looking for electronics and amplification systems, studied some projects of acoustic loudspeakers, trumpets and subwoofer cases, and started to build his own sound system. OrganoMotore was born. The name comes from the first prototype, which was made with the PVC tubes, like the pipes of a church organ, and eventually they were replaced with wood structures to reach its final form. In 2024, Nicola and Giuseppe took it on tour and they invited many musicians to play with it in each place they installed it. They were even able to take it into a deconsecrated church on a deserted island in the middle of the Venice lagoon. OrganoMotore is not just a weird and made sound system. It is a sculpture, an instrument, something that transforms the space with its physicality and the sound that it produces. An amazing artwork that I decided I wanted to play with. I asked Nicola and Giuseppe when. They answered me. May 2025. In April and May 2025, OrganoMotore was exhibited in Villa Davia, a 17th century villa in Borgo di Colle Ameno, Sasso Marconi, near Bologna. It was part of the contemporary art exhibition Closer by Studio Yoshida, Spazio, Relativo and Adiacenze. A few hundred meters from Colle Ameno there is Villa Griffone, the place where Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of the radio, discovered the possibility of communicating wirelessly over a distance and made his first experiments at the end of the 19th century. Now Villa Griffone is the Marconi's museum. Closer takes place here. The exhibition draws inspiration from Marconi's scientific legacy to investigate the relationship between technology and the human through the language of contemporary art. I got a bump in my stomach. OrganoMotore and an exhibition dedicated to radio communications. It was perfect. The first live performance of To Communicate, played on OrganoMotore, sounded like a dream. I immediately started planning. I asked my dad to help me and teach me how to set up an antenna and a radio receiver. We chose to use a single pole antenna, basically a cable, that can be attached anywhere up in the air between 2 points. Because even if it was a rudimentary solution, it was also the easiest way to overcome the site-specific problems related to the place where OrganoMotore was. But it was also a sort of philological solution, because it was basically the same system used by Marconi in his first experiments. Another coincidence. Or maybe not. We made a couple of tests at home. He explained me some fundamentals on how to use the radio and place the antenna. I packed everything, my no-input mixers, the radio and the antenna that my dad lent me, and I went to Villa Davia for a 3 days long art residency that will end up with a concert on the 7th of May, my birthday. What a great way to celebrate it. This is an antenna. I set it up in the back of Villa Davia, between the ruins of some of its older wings and a window in the room where OrganoMotore was placed. I connected it to the radio and the radio into my no-input and feedback-based setup, where the audio mixers, equalizers and filters are patched into themselves to generate sound. I played with it for 3 days. On the second day, I was also lucky to catch a radio amateur doing his final exam and gain his license. Without this license, you cannot legally transmit any signal through radio waves. Of course, I don't have one, so I was only able to listen and receive for technical reasons. The radio that I have, the antenna and the power required to send the signals are not enough to transmit. This is intended, of course, and it is part of the project too, because I'm not doing a radio amateur session, but a concert using the soundscape generated by all of these communications. A soundscape that, through science and technology, literally represents the basic human need to overcome distances, to create bridges between people, to connect ourselves with the world, and feel less alone in the chaotic and unreadable mess that our reality is. To communicate cannot exist without my dad. I wanted him to be an essential part of this composition, not only for the technical side of it, but also in the final concert as an active sound element. I asked him to transmit exactly at the time of the concert on a certain frequency so I can listen to him. This is the result. I've never talked that much with my dad. He is quite discreet and silent about his inner world, his emotions. We haven't had many conversations during our lifetime about our feelings. Nonetheless, we really love and support each other in every situation, both good and bad. But this lack of communication has always bothered me, more and more during the last years. I know that I'm responsible for this too, so I decided to make a change. Now that we are becoming older, I want to try to create a new bridge between us, a way to communicate. Music and sound, a creative process that involves one of his passions, the radio, specifically conceived to supply this basic human need for connections and communications, seemed the perfect way to do it. A way to make things together, to be creative, to talk and to listen, to connect deeply with each other.
Nonno la comprava la televisione nel 68 per le Olimpiadi di Città del Messico.
Ah, ok.
Verso la fine degli anni 60 faceva i programmi per i ragazzi. Era una serie, storia di un nonno e di un nipote. Il nonno faceva un lavoro strano, nel senso che faceva il guardiano di un faro.
Ok.
Comunicava con la terraferma, eccetera, mediante la radio. E da là, così, la curiosità delle trasmissioni radio, e dopo, quando fai il liceo, durante il periodo estivo sono andato a lavorare e ho recuperato la prima radio e la prima antenna. Era l'unico modo per avere la possibilità di sentire in giro per il mondo qualcosa di diverso, insomma era l'unico modo per andare un po' in giro per il mondo.
Quando è che hai cominciato invece poi anche a costruirle le antenne?
Qualche anno per iniziare a capire un po' come si faceva, quindi ho recuperato libri, perché una volta non era internet.
Beh sì.
Ho recuperato libri tecnici in inglese, perché in italiano non c'era quasi niente. Visto tecnicamente come si calcola un'antenna, come che anche meccanicamente le da costruirle, perché nel caschezzo.
Certo.
È sempre comunque una ricerca per risentire magari una stazione che nei 20 anni non ti sente più, risentire magari gente che dopo ti ha avuto la fortuna di conoscere una persona. Rientra sempre nel discorso dei rapporti umani, anche la radio, anche se fa una roba tecnica, però alla fine è sempre due persone che per qualche motivo le si incrocia, le parla. Questo è uno dei tanti metodi, insomma, che ognuno di noi nella vita si fa per soddisfare le curiosità proprie, e utilizza gli strumenti che consente di approfondire di là. Mi usa questi.
To communicate for me has a personal and emotional value beside its universal meaning. Of course, this is just a little step. I couldn't understand exactly what my dad was trying to say to me during the performance, because due to a technical reason, the antenna that we used is better suited to listen to transmissions that come from way afar, thousands of kilometers instead of hundreds. He was too close to me to be heard clearly. Ironic and paradoxical, or maybe not. Maybe this has a meaning too. It didn't work this time. I couldn't hear him clearly. But it is an attempt to communicate, in a rudimentary way maybe, and failure is part of the process too. Communication doesn't work every time. It is full of compromises, misunderstandings, conflicts, distance. But it is important to try, again and again. In these dark and violent times, where borders and wars are part of our everyday lives, to communicate is more necessary than ever. We need to do it. I want to do it. And I will.